Hi everyone, welcome back to Guilt Index. This is episode 2, Portrait as Power Play. I begin as always with the index. Let's get started. Let's set the scene. It is November 2025 in New York City at Sotheby's, and there's an auction taking place. And there is a 6-foot tall portrait of a young woman. Bidding begins, it ends in 20 minutes, and the work is sold for $236.4 million. That makes it the most expensive work sold at auction at Sotheby's and the second most expensive work sold at auction ever. And what's so interesting about this is it's not a landscape, it's not a Monet, it's not an abstract expressionist painting, it's a portrait of a specific person with a name. So her name was Elisabeth Lederer, and she was the daughter of August and Serena Lederer, and they were the second wealthiest Jewish family in Vienna behind the Rothschilds, and they were one of Gustav Klimt's most important patrons. And in 1914, Gustav Klimt painted their daughter Elisabeth, and it took him over 3 years, and this was a very large portrait, over 6 feet tall. And in that portrait, Elisabeth is wearing this beautiful East Asian emperor's cloak and is surrounded by that gold fine detailing that we all know and love from Klimt, especially in his later years. And this portrait is clearly the work of someone who spent a very long time looking at this specific person. So when the Nazis came for their family in 1938, they ended up seizing the entire Lederer collection. So Elisabeth was Jewish, and deportation was the word they used for what was coming. And so her mother, Serena, ended up signing an affidavit. She told the Nazis that Elisabeth was only half Jewish, and a result of a long ongoing affair with Gustav Klimt, making Elisabeth only half Jewish. So she ended up saving her daughter. And what I want to be clear about is that she offered up this portrait as evidence. She offered up this as, look at what her father created of her. This is someone that adored her. It took 3 years to make. Look at how finely detailed. Only a father's love could express this in portraiture. And Elisabeth was saved. Authorities obviously did end up believing it, and Elisabeth remained in Vienna until 1944, when she sadly passed away from illness. So the painting was given to her brother in 1948, and then it passed through several hands until it reached Leonard Lauder, who is an heir to the Estee Lauder fortune, and he owned it for over 40 years. He died in June 2025 at the age of 92. So the November sale was from his estate. So the portrait that was commissioned to signal a family's wealth and position in society became the document that kept one of them alive. And then it sold for $236 million. That is the index, and is also the whole argument of this episode, which is that a portrait has never just been a likeness, it has always been a transaction. And the terms of that transaction have not fundamentally changed in a little over 600 years. So every portrait is a financial document, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because I think the word financial does something to people when you put it next to the word art. Like, it sounds rather reductive. It's like saying, oh, art is all about money and the rest is window dressing. But what I mean is that it's structural. A portrait is a negotiation. It's between the person that paid for it, the person that's sitting for it, the artist, and kind of what it wants to do. And every one of those negotiations has a price, a literal price, meaning what the commission costs, and a social price, meaning what the portrait was intended to purchase. It could be status, it could be power, and it could be legitimacy, the appearance of belonging somewhere you may or may not have been born into. The thing that intrigues me about portraits specifically as a category is that this negotiation is never hidden. It's built into the form. You look at the portrait and you are immediately aware that someone sat still for this, someone paid for this, and someone decided that this face was worth recording. The decisions are visible in the object, and the portrait is already about power. And what I want to trace today is how that logic runs through the Medici, through Tudor England, through the Dutch Republic, and lands unchanged at a Sotheby sale room in November 2025. The Medici were bankers. I say this not to be reductive because I think it truly gets lost in the reverence that surrounds them. So Cosimo de' Medici, Duke of Florence from 1537, was the descendant of a family that built their power through finance. They lent money to popes, and they ran one of the most sophisticated financial networks in all of Europe. And Cosimo had a problem that every newly powerful institution eventually confronts. He needed to look like he had always been there. So around 1543, as Cosimo consolidated his power in Florence, Bronzino was commissioned to produce the Duke's official portrait, and Thyssen Bornemisia's own scholarly essay on this painting is very specific about what happened next. The portrait became a prototype for around 20 versions and copies. Bronzino obviously executed the original, his studio and other painters executed the replicas that followed. And those replicas went to allied courts, diplomatic contacts, and anyone who needed to understand visually who was running Florence. So the painting shows Cosimo in armor, one hand resting on his helmet, and he is 25 years old at the time of this painting. And here's the thing that I find quite intriguing. The scholarly literature is quite clear that Cosimo had not really at this point distinguished himself militarily. The armor is what the Thyssen essay calls military success by proxy. He's wearing the visual language of power he had not yet earned in the battlefield, so almost kind of like a stolen valor situation. So Bronzino painted not what Cosimo was, but what the political moment required him to appear to be. So the technique of the face is everything in this portrait. So Bronzino's portraiture is famous for what the Art Gallery of New South Wales catalogue describes as faces that are like polished stones. The surface is closed and the expression is impenetrable. There is nothing in Cosimo's face that invites you in or explains itself. And I think that this is the most sophisticated thing that Bronzino does in his portraiture, more sophisticated than even the armor itself, because he's painting a specific kind of authority, the kind that has stopped justifying itself. The face almost says, I am not here to persuade you. I'm here because I just am here. The painting is not an argument, it is a declaration. What I personally find very interesting about the Medici, portrait program, as someone who works and kind of lives in the art history world and someone who really wants to understand power dynamics and how power presents itself now, is that it's structurally identical to what we would call today brand management. They were investing in a visual identity that would outlast any individual political moment, and it worked. They were extremely successful at this. Cosimo has been dead for nearly 500 years, and the political structures he operated within have been gone for centuries. But walk through the Uffizi today and you come away with a very specific feeling about who the Medici were. The feeling was extremely designed and curated. It was commissioned. It was paid for at a specific moment to serve a specific political need. And it's still performing that function. That is a 500-year return on a 16th century investment in an image. And I don't think we talk about it that way nearly enough. Hans Holbein painted Henry VIII in 1537. The original is lost. It was part of a mural at Whitehall Palace that was destroyed by a fire in 1698. We only knew what it looked like because it was copied many times by many different artists across many different decades. And I think that is the most interesting thing about it, because it means the image survived the object. The portrait's power was not located in any single canvas, it was in the replication. The National Portrait Gallery in London holds the preparatory cartoon for the left section of the mural. Their entry on it describes it plainly as one of the most famous depictions of personal power ever produced. A 17th century account records that visitors felt in the presence of the mural abashed and annihilated. Those are the words, abashed and annihilated, by a painting. The Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool holds one of the copies derived from Holbein's original. Their catalog entry says it was intended to reinforce the strength of the Tudor dynasty and Henry's total authority. And the ArtNet piece from December 2025, covering a major Holbein exhibition, documents what Henry actually did with the image. He had versions distributed to courtiers across England and to his ambassadors all across Europe. He gave copies of this as gifts. He encouraged major nobles to commission their own versions as demonstrations of loyalty. The image was infrastructure, one would say. You hung the king's face in your home to say, I am on the right side. The constructed lie at the center of it is what I find most compelling as an art historian. Scholars have been able to compare the portrait to Henry's surviving suits of armor and confirm that his legs were considerably shorter than how Holbein painted them. By 1537, Henry VIII was around 40, and his health was in a serious decline after a jousting accident the previous year, and he had spent the preceding decade executing people, including two of his wives and his closest advisors. Holbein painted him tall, broad, legs planted apart, filling the entire frame with a pure physical dominance. The French ambassador quoted in the National Portrait Gallery's catalog entry had described Henry as not merely a king to be obeyed, but an idol to be worshipped. Holbein was making that description visual. What strikes me about this, thinking about it from the outside, is that Henry understood something about image and distribution that feels really modern, genuinely modern. You do not control a narrative by making one perfect thing. You control it by making that thing almost unavoidable. Wherever you look, you'll see something. The portrait went everywhere. It became the way people understood what Henry looked like, which meant it became the way they understood what Henry was. The image did the political work because the image was everywhere and reality was complicated. I think about this every time I see a tech founder who has cultivated a very specific public image, perhaps the turtleneck, the specific pose, the controlled set of photographs that circulate until they become the shorthand of an entire idea of who this person is. Henry figured it out in 1537. He just used oil paint and loyal noblemen instead of Instagram. The portrait before the Dutch Golden Age was mostly an aristocratic form. You sat for one because you were significant enough for your face and position to be worth recording. And that significance had to be inherited. You could not simply purchase it. The Dutch Republic changed this, and the reason it changed is economic. The merchant class of 17th century Amsterdam had extraordinary wealth. We touched on this last episode. I highly recommend looking through that and possibly hopping back in. It was made through the VOC and the financial instruments they were inventing in real time, but they were not aristocratic. They had not been born into the tradition of sitting for portraits. And they wanted it because portraits had always been the visual language of power, and they had power now. So they did something very Dutch, which is to say very practical and extremely clever. They made the form collective. The Guild portrait and the Civic Guard portrait are the Dutch Republic's specific contribution to the history of portraiture, and the financial structure of these commissions are different from everything that came before. Each member of the group actually paid into the commission. The placement of your figure in the composition, how prominently you appear to be, could actually be negotiated. You could, in a very literal sense, buy a better position in the painting. There are records of exactly this. In fact, the portrait was a collectively purchased status document, and everyone involved understood precisely what they were purchasing. Rembrandt's Syndics of the Drapers Guild from 1662, now on display at the Rijksmuseum, is where I think this form reaches its most interesting moment. 6 men around a table, and Rembrandt gives them this quality of having been caught mid-meeting. One is in the process of standing, one is already standing, and one is looking directly at you with an expression of someone who had somewhere else to be, almost a look of disinterest. And that is the specific argument Rembrandt is making. These men are very busy, their time is valuable. Even in a portrait, even sitting still for a painter, they have the air of people for whom sitting still costs something. That is a very particular kind of status claim, and it is completely contemporary. We still understand it immediately because we still operate by that same logic. The busiest people are the most important people, and the most important people signal their importance by performing busyness. Rembrandt was painting this idea in 1662. What I find genuinely moving about the Dutch merchant portrait as a category is what it reveals between the relationship between money and legitimacy. Obviously, these men had the money. They did not yet have the cultural permission to simply be significant. The portrait was the mechanism by which they purchased that permission. And it really did work. The Syndics hang in the Rijksmuseum now, and we look at them with the same reverence we bring to any other major work of art. The transaction succeeded, and the legitimacy was purchased. The portrait did its job so well that we all have forgotten it was a transaction at all. The Klimt sold for over $236 million, and I want to go back to that and think about it not as a record, which is usually how it was reported through most media and art outlets, but as a data point about what the portrait market is actually measuring. The provenance of the Elisabeth Lederer portrait is unusually complete. Sotheby's lot record traces it precisely. It was commissioned by the Lederer family in 1914, seized in Vienna in November of 1938, formally confiscated in December of 1939, and given back to Elisabeth's brother in 1948. It was sold to a dealer in 1983 and then acquired by Leonard Lauder in 1985. Lauder then owned it for 40 years, lent it repeatedly to the New Gallery here in New York. It's actually one of my favorite galleries and has one of my favorite restaurants also in the city. Please go visit. And then actually his brother Ronald had founded it specifically for Viennese art of this period. Lauder then passed away in June 2025, and the November sale was the inaugural auction at Sotheby's new headquarters in the Brewer building on Madison Avenue. 6 bidders competed, and it started at $130 million and ended at $205 million hammer price. Here is the observation I want to make that I have not seen made anywhere else. Portraits specifically keep breaking records in the contemporary art market in a way that other genres don't, and I think the reason is this. A portrait accumulates narrative in a way that a landscape or an abstract simply cannot. The person in the painting has a story, and that story attaches to the object over time and compounds. The Elisabeth Lederer portrait is worth $236 million, partly because of Klimt's hand and his specific style, but it is also worth $236 million because of everything that happened around it. You know, the seizure, the survival story, Serena's affidavit, Elisabeth telling the Nazis that Klimt was her father, and the painting being the evidence. The restitution, the Lauder collection, 80 years of history embedding itself into a 6-foot canvas. None of that is possible with a haystack. Monet's haystacks are amazing in and of itself, and they sell for $110 million. But the haystack doesn't have a name, it doesn't have, a family, and it doesn't have a survival story. The portrait contains a person, and persons accumulate history. This is why I think portrait records will keep climbing while other categories will plateau. The narrative is the asset. The person in the painting is doing financial work just by existing, just by having lived a life attached to itself, to the object. That is a form of value creation that is unique to portraiture, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. The contemporary vanity portrait market is the same logic in present tense. There is a firm in New York called Seville Fine Portraiture. It is ran by a former Christie's specialist that manages portrait commissions at the top of the market. Major commissions run from $50,000 to over $500,000. The clients are hedge fund managers, founders, and institutional leaders. People who have money and want the specific thing a painted portrait gives them that a photograph cannot. What the photograph cannot do is locate you in a tradition. A photograph exists in the present. It says, this is what I looked like at this exact moment. A painted portrait exists in a lineage. It says, I'm the kind of person whose face gets painted. And that lineage, that sense of having always belonged to the people for whom this was done, is exactly what new money needs and cannot simply buy. The portrait is the closest available approximation. Cosimo understood this in 1543 when he put on armor he had not earned to sit for Bronzino. The armor was not about battles, it was about position. The suit in the lobby portrait is the same armor. The logic has not changed, only the tailor has. So that was Gilt Index episode 2, from the Lederer family in Vienna to Bronzino's studio in Florence to a corporate lobby in Midtown. A portrait has never just been about likeness, it has always been a transaction, and the terms of that transaction have not changed in over 600 years. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching, and next episode will be The Impressionists Were a Startup. Thank you so much. Bye!